My name is Benjamin Lessing, and it's my immense pleasure to welcome you to the third installment of our series, The Outlook for Brazilian Democracy. This series is organized by the Center for Latin American Studies at University of Chicago, together with a group of Brazilian students here at University of Chicago, and it is co-sponsored by the Chicago Center on Democracy. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I want to let you know that you can see videos and recaps of the first two installments of our series at the series website, which will appear shortly in the chat here on Zoom. The first installment was with legal scholar Lenio Streck, who discussed Lava Jato and the role of the Supreme Court, among other things. The second installment was with Supreme Court Justice and President of the Superior Electoral Court, Luis Roberto Barroso. I found them both extremely informative. I learned a great deal, and so I hope you'll check those out. Today's installment is a particularly special one for me. It's on armed threats to democracy. And I'm just thrilled to have with us today four of Brazil's top experts on public security, violence, policing, and civil military relations. I count all of you among my not just colleagues, but also friends. And I want to personally thank you all for taking the time today out of your busy schedules to have this conversation. I will introduce our panelists in just a second, but let me make first a few notes about logistics. I've asked the four panelists, or five panelists, as you'll see, to make short presentations about their particular threat. I've sort of asked each panelist to talk about a specific threat. Police, paramilitary groups known as milícias and other illegal armed groups, armed civilian groups and political militancy groups, the military itself, and police, in particular military police, acting in newly politicized ways. And then we're going to move to a group discussion where we talk about the ways that these threats could potentially interact in nefarious or worst case scenario sorts of ways that could interfere with Brazil's upcoming elections, or a potential peaceful transfer of power, and democracy and democratic institutions in general moving forward from this tumultuous period in Brazil's history. To make life easier for our panelists, the discussion portion of today's event will be in Portuguese. I think that if there's value added in today's event, it's particularly in this sort of cross-pollination of ideas and really thinking about the ways that different kinds of threats could potentially interact. So we're going to have that conversation in Portuguese, and we'll have simultaneous interpretation into English that will be available during that portion of the event. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn to our panelists and introduce them in alphabetical order, which is the order that we're going to follow for the presentations as well. First, we have Bruno Paismanzo, who is a PhD in political science from the University of São Paulo. He's a journalist and a researcher at the Center for the Study of Violence at USP at University of São Paulo. And he's the author most recently of A República das Milícias, or A Milícia Republic, which has also been now turned into a fabulous podcast. I was just listening to this morning, so if you do understand Portuguese, check out the podcast. He's also the author of the book A Guerra, The War, which is really, together with Camila Diaz, it's one of the best books about the PCC and the rise of factions across Brazil that out there. Carolina Ricardo is a lawyer, sociologist, and executive director of Instituto Sou da Paes, a position she undertook after 14 years leading projects at the Institute and serving as director of programs. She previously worked at São Paulo's Institute Against Violence and was a consultant for the World Bank, the International Development Bank, the Ministry of Social Justice, the International Center for the Prevention of Crime in Canada. For those of you who don't know Instituto Sou da Paes, key player in the passing of Brazil's disarmament statute back in 2003, and now being under sort of attempts to be undone under the Bolsonaro government. Oliver Della Costa Stuenkel is an associate professor at the School of International Relations at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in São Paulo. He is also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., a non-resident fellow at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin, and a columnist for the New Statesman and the Americas Quarterly. He's also a previous speaker here at Center for Latin American Studies. For those of you who happen to catch him in person, I think that was 2019, pre-pandemic for sure. He gave us a really fascinating talk on Bolsonaro's 3 pillars of support. Renato Sérgio de Lima is a professor at the Department of Public Management at São Paulo School of Business Management at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas. And he is the chief executive officer of the Brazilian Fórum on Public Safety, the Fórum Brasileiro Segurança, Pública, one of the really key institutions in Brazil's civil society complex dealing with issues of public security today. He has developed numerous projects on violence, public security, transparency, and public statistics. Unfortunately, Renato's had a very important meeting come up, and he's going to have to leave a bit early, but he's going to leave us in the capable hands of David Marques, who is project coordinator at the Brazilian Fórum of Public Security. David has a PhD in sociology from the Federal University of São Carlos, São Paulo State, and recently defended his dissertation entitled The Business of Chacinas, or Massacres, or Multiple Homicides, Senses of Justice, Privatization of Security, and Police Corruption in São Paulo. So we're sorry to lose you, Renato, but we're happy to have you, David, and we look forward to hearing from the work that you've done at the Fórum Segurança Pública. Finally, before we get started, I just want to say one thing, which is that the threats that we're going to be talking about today, I think the point of today's discussion is not to say that these threats are more likely than not to happen. The point of the discussion is not to be alarmist. The point of this discussion is to think through worst case scenarios. And so some of the kinds of threats that I think motivated today's talk when we started planning this event back last year, say in August and September and November, when things looked quite dire, some of those threats may have waned in the intervening months, and that's a good thing. We hope that these armed threats to democracy don't materialize. We hope that they remain very improbable. Nonetheless, it's worth discussing them and talking about them because the downside risks are immense. And so with bearing that in mind, let me turn to our first speaker, Bruno Paismanzo.
Hi, Benjamin. Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss with you about the Brazilian problems. They are huge, but it's always a good way to try to thinking about it. So I think it's a good point. I think I'm going to talk about the militias are not a threat of the election, this election of this year, but we need to pay attention because it's a kind of prevention thought. We need to think about this year. It will be a very important year, and we need to pay attention and to thinking what's going to happen. So I'm going to start to make a kind of a presentation of the problem of the concept of the militia. I'm going to pass through a short story of the crime and the militia in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, the second city in Brazil. And after, in the end of the presentation, I'm going to try to think with you about the challenge of the situation of crime in Rio and in Brazil. So armed threats to democracy in Brazil, milícias, paramilitares groups. First of all, it's important to say that militia is not a good term to think about this issue. I think militia is the same in English as in Portuguese. It's seen as a group, armed group, to resist to the force of the states. This name were given by a journalist because of the short space of the newspapers. So the title would fit a short word, so militia was the name that we use. But I think the best way of thinking about this kind of group, it's a kind of paramilitares mafias. So I'm going to show you this first picture. Is the picture of the Rio de Janeiro, map of Rio de Janeiro, the armed groups in Rio de Janeiro. We did this research 2 years ago in 2020, and you can see painting by different colors, the armed groups splitting the territories of Rio de Janeiro. So there are more than 700 communities, neighborhoods, controlled by armed groups today in Rio de Janeiro. The blue one are the neighborhoods controlled by Milícias. The red one is the neighborhood controlled by a drug trafficking group, Red Command, Comando Vermelho. The green one is opposition of Comando Vermelho. It's called Third Command, Terceiro Comando. And the yellow one is Friends of Friends, the different groups. So when I say control, you can thinking about some 100, 200 people with rifle, heavy guns, like AK-47 or so, impose their laws to the community of 100,000, 200,000 of people, and establish a kind of silent law of silence law, that the people are not allowed to talk about their business because they want to become rich. So it's very hard to live in this place like this, and you can see in the next 1 million people, or 33% of the population, live in area nowadays controlled by Milícia in Rio de Janeiro. 1 million people, or 18% of population, live in area controlled by Red Command. 300,000 people in area, or 5% in area controlled by Third Command. 48,000 people live in areas controlled by Friends of Friends. So it's amazing because it's a kind of pre-republic way of doing politics. So you have this challenge of the people living in these neighborhoods, that they don't have the same rule of law of all the city. And if you think about all the city, just 2% of the city is run by the institution, by the rule of law. So it's a huge challenge of the daily life for the people who lives in this place. So I'm going to tell you about militia and to try to explain you what's militia means in this territory, what kind of control, what kind of power they establish in this territory. Militia emerged and were strengthened in the 2000s, initially by presenting themselves as an antidote to the control exercised by the drug gangs. So this kind of narrative, or this kind of speech made by the milicianos, the paramilitares, were very important. It's the same in Mexico, it's the same in Colombia, because they present themselves as an antidote, or someone who wants to fight against the drug groups. So it's a kind of legitimate, they got legitimacy in this kind of speech. Active participation of police, prison guards, and military agents in militia leaderships. Many had connections to these regions and to local residents' associations. They make money from a wide variety of criminal enterprises, extorting residents and shopkeepers, selling plots of land in environmentally protected areas, or selling other unauthorized building projects, and retailing cooking gas, internet services, water, contraband cigarettes, and in time nowadays drug as well. In the beginning they fight against drug dealers, nowadays they are selling drug at the same time. They also influence votes in elections, increasing their political and economical power with the support of institutions. This picture is there are some buildings like this. They are selling, and they are made by the milicianos and selling to the population. And 2 years ago, 2 of these buildings just fell down, and more than 24 people died because of this kind of construction is not legal, is irregular, and not fiscalized by the government. So I just show you this picture. It's a very famous movie of Brazilian cinema, City of God. I'm not sure you should watch it. It was released in 2002 when the problem was totally different in Rio de Janeiro, because the real problem in that time was the drug dealing in the drug traffic groups, like the people in City of God. The movie is about this gang, the beginning of Red Command in City of God in 2002. And you can see now, I show you besides the map, City of God nowadays, it's like here, it's the red one surrounded by just blue one groups, just surrounded by militia groups. So City of God's a kind of small place of Red Command, rounded by militias group all in all sides. Is a completely different situation. So if to understand why militias rise their power, you need to understand their speech and their connection with the environment of the city and of the Rio de Janeiro. So a short story of this phenomenon. You need to understand the growth of the cities in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, from the 40s to 2000. The city grew very quickly and disordered way. So you have a lot of lands in the hills, around the hills in the city, and great fear of the population about the criminals. From the 50s and the 60s, the police force, they didn't know what to do. So you can see just this picture in black and white is the same. Beside is Barra da Tijuca, it's a place in Rio in the 50s and 50 years after. So they grow very, very fast, and the institutions were not able to deal with that. So in this environment, you have these two kinds of ways of dealing with that. In the police force, you got idea of war on crime that begins in 50s and 60s. The homicidal paramilitary groups take on different formats, compositions, and name. From that squads to Scuderia Lecoq, a brotherhood of policemen present in several Brazil capital cities, to the vigilantes in extermination groups in Baixada Fluminense, different neighborhoods around the capital, the Rio de Janeiro. So you need to understand that in that way, the violence was seen instead of a problem of Rio and a problem of Brazil. The violence was seen for the institution as an instrument, as a tool to solve problems, as a tool to get order. So you got a population with fear, and the institution sees the violence as a tool for order, to get the order back. So they make association with gambling. It's a Brazilian game mafia, very strong in the city. And they made this partnership that comes from 50s and 60s. Violence plus corruption. Police and paramilitary groups together with Brazil games mafia. So this is important to understand the story of police in Rio, the problems of police. So this is the symbol of Scuderia Lecoq. It's a school representing death, and death as a way of solving problem, as a way of getting order. And this is the card of a killer that is suspect to kill Marielle Franco, the Brazilian activist. And when he got inside the police, the first year that he was in the police, he got inside this Scuderia Lecoq in the beginning of the 90s, 30 years after he was suspect of killing Marielle Franco and another different accusations of different crimes. So you need to understand that the other way, the drug trafficking, from the 70s and from the 80s, Medellin and Cali cartels starts to sell drugs around the world. And Rio de Janeiro in São Paulo was a marketing and a way of distributing drugs to Europe. So it starts in Rio and poor neighborhoods in São Paulo and Rio, internal market of drugs, very important after the AIDS. So strategy of retail drugs operation in Rio de Janeiro, based on controlled territory, and was consolidated by Red Command after AIDS. So you need to understand the geography of Rio is the poor parts of the city is very close to the rich parts of the city. So the markets, you can buy drugs in this land, different from São Paulo, where the poor neighborhoods are very far from the center. So in Rio, it was allowed, it was possible to sell drugs controlling territories by force and by arms. So territory rivalries such as the Third Command in the AIDS and Amigos dos Amigos, Friends of Friends in the nights, in configuration that underwent successive changes and set off recurring disputes. It's a kind of arms race. So they start to fight for territories, they start to buy arms, they start to buy rifle, and was a kind of war against the groups. Policing, especially in the 90s and after, would focus its energy on the hills, get inside the hills, get inside these territories where the favelas had been established, leading to numerous killings and shootouts involving heavy weaponry, including tanks and helicopters. Stray bullets caused the tragic deaths of children and adults caught in the crossfire. So you can see a tank, the police of Rio de Janeiro tanks is called Caveirão. It's a big school. And it's used to get inside these lands in this war on crime. So you can see this fight and the homicides curve that rises very much and very quickly from the 80s to the 90s. It starts to drop, and after 2000, and Rio de Janeiro is one of the most dangerous city in the world with higher number of homicides and the most violent police in the world. So this is the way of the population that I interview in my podcast, in my book of Rio de Janeiro, say about the city. This is a game, and they see Rio de Janeiro, and they use this metaphor, this image that Rio de Janeiro is a kind of Game of Thrones. 700 territories ruled by kings with heavy weapons, with rifles, 100, 200, 300, 400 rifles. They establish the rule, they establish the law, and they fight against each other as a pre-republican way of doing politicians. So you see this game, it's a very famous game. I'm not sure if there is this game in the United States. It's a war, it's about the World War, but they did this game with the slangs and the map of the city, and Red Command, police, militias, ADA, and the war in the city. So for the conclusion, what I would say about the Brazil and the elections is that the Rio de Janeiro shows that the control of the police or the lack of control of the police, it's a huge problem of politicians and power, of institutionality. And as you can see, as Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, the lack of control over the police is it's a huge problem in the last 5 or 6 years. The police killings come from 2000 to more than 6,000 in 7 years. So the homicides committed by the police shows the lack of control of the government over the police. So the homicide of the police is the beginning of the militias, because if the police see that they can kill, they start to kill to making money, to make business. and they run out of control. So we have nowadays this challenge because of this government that they have this kind of speech, the same speech as used to have in the 50s and 60s. Bolsonaro is a ideological representative of this way of seeing the world, that violence is a tool of order. It's necessary to get inside a war against our enemies. So because of this speech and this way of saying word, you have a big problem to control the authorities, to control the institution. So I think we need to pay attention. And nowadays, because of the arms in the hands of the populations, about this potential mess, because Bolsonaro win with the mess, because they want to be the macho alpha, the stronger, in a jungle. Democracy is bad for him. He needs a jungle to have power, to have guns, to have a speech of war. And he is the only way of doing things nowadays, the only way of victory, a big mess in the end of the year. So you need to pay attention. It's not, I don't want to be alarmist, but we need to watch this way of Brazilian is following now. So sorry about my English, sorry about that. I just stopped studying English 20 years ago, so I hope it worked. Thank you, Ben, and I want to talk with you after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. That was a great presentation. And the photo of Ronnie Lessa, you know, for those of you not familiar, Ronnie Lessa is a miliciano, former, I believe, a former Polícia Militar, who is you know, one of the killers of Marielle Franco. And it's precisely this kind of violence against politicians that was so shocking and seemed so improbable just a few years ago that now is, you know, potentially a part of reality in Brazil, of violence that could be coordinated through these kind of militia, police-linked militia groups that Bruno, you know, just explained the precedents from. I have a ton of questions, but I think we should move on, and we'll get to the conversation in a little bit. Carolina, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the status of civilian armament, civilian armed citizenry, and political militancy in the Bolsonaro era.
Well, hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ben, for the invitation. I have two topics I would like to discuss. The first one is the risks of civilian gun ownership. And the second one is violence and intimidation against politicians and the relation of these phenomena with the elections this year. To begin, I would like to give an overview on the risks of civilian gun ownership. And I would like to show a little bit the number of weapons, how it has increased in the last few years. To have an idea, in 2021, Brazil reached the record in the number of civilians with access to firearms. As of November of 2021, the Army granted 1,162 new permits per day to the specific categories that involve hunter, sport shooters, and collectors, the CACs. This is more than double the 567 permits recorded daily in the last year, in 2020. This is an increase of more than 300% over 2018. Not counting the firearms registered by citizens who buy that guns for self-defense. It's about 450,000 new weapons in 2001 alone. So it's possible to say that Brazilian civilian population is much more armed today than it was in 2018, 1 year just before Bolsonaro, 1 year just right before Bolsonaro started to be president. So that's a very important fact. The second aspect I would like to discuss is that President Bolsonaro legitimizes the political use of weapons, the political use of guns. To give an example to illustrate, at the famous April 2021 ministerial meeting, that we have Moro. It was a very important ministerial meeting that media showed in Brazil. President Bolsonaro called on his ministers and said, I want to open up the issue of gun ownership. If a city mayor makes a decree forcing citizens to stay at home, they have to be able to defend themselves with the guns. This was a discursive landmark in legitimizing the use of firearms to oppose mayors and governors' political decisions regarding pandemic issues. It kind of authorized citizens to make political use of their weapons, which is very, very serious. The third aspect I'd like to discuss is that pro-gun activism spreads gun culture that flirts with authoritarian and anti-democratic outbursts. Pro-gun groups seek to gain strength along the lines of the American NRA. To give an example, they use the idea of it's not about gun, it's about freedom, just like NRA. And they work alongside congressmen to lobby for the approval of legislation that would facilitate access to weapons with wide mobilization on social networks and also offline. They are a very noisy and organized militancy. These are groups that largely defend the individual's right to self-defense, but that flirt with anti-democratic positions. To give an example or some examples about this anti-democratic position that we have started to see in the last years. At the meeting promoted by pro-gun groups on June of 2021, it was common to hear inflammatory speeches either against the Supreme Court and also delegitimizing the Brazilian elections in the case of electronic voting. Another important example, it was in 2020, we faced the camp of the 300s in defense of the president. Let me try to explain. They were a group of right-wing extremist militants camped in front of the Palácio do Planalto, the presidential place. And they were there for many days, making a lot of threatening to the Supreme Court and everything. And they were suspects of possessing firearms. It was very, very impressive. A group camped in front of the president's building, probably with guns, and discussing a lot of democratic speech. And another example was even worse, I think. It was a vehicle ramming attack against the Ministry of Justice building by a citizen who thought he was attacking the Supreme Court. He misdecided and went to the Ministry of Justice building, but he wanted to go against the Supreme Court with his car. But just a few days before, this individual had his weapons apprehended while on his way to Brazil. So if he could be armed with a gun in this attack, if the police has not apprehended the gun some days before. So there are three episodes. They can be a little bit like punctual, but it's important to explain how it's possible that this mix between gun and authoritarian and threats to democracy, we are seeing this kind of relationship in Brazil in the last years. So it's important to say that the president has a strong and armed support base. Would they be able to take up arms to defend interests concerning the president? Is it possible to have a capital in Brazil in an effort to delegitimize the elections results? I don't know the answer, but I think it's very important to make this question and think about it. And I think we can discuss a little bit more about that in the next conversation. And the second topic I would like to debate is violence and intimidation against politicians. It's important to say that Brazil has a very worrying situation regarding candidate murders. A research carried out by Pablo Nunes from CESEC in Rio pointed out that in 2020, from January until the eve of municipal elections, at least 84 politicians and candidates were murdered in Brazil. and 105 suffered other types of attacks or attempted murders. Unfortunately, it's not possible to explain the exactly motivation behind each one of these crimes. But some hypotheses are violence against political opponents, retaliation against people who denounced cases of corruption, cases of fraud, and crimes committed by candidates and politicians, or simply a way to inhibit monitoring and social control over public management. And unfortunately, too, cases are not properly investigated and they go unpunished. Still, research on this matter points to an important link between many of these cases and militias and other organized crime structures. Rio de Janeiro, as Bruno has showed, has stood out in this regard. And I will discuss a little bit about this relation with militias, just like Bruno. In the Baixada Fluminense in Rio de Janeiro, there is this specificity, which is the more directly involvement of militias in this political violence. Until November of 2020, there were 14 politicians shot in the region, with 8 deaths. Only in the year of the 2020, the municipal elections, 14 politicians shot and 8 deaths. During the month of the elections, only in the month of the elections, there were 7 attacks with 3 deaths. In the biggest municipality of the Baixada, Duque de Caxias, 3 of the 29 councilmen were killed in 2021. So it's important to see that it's something that it's happening in Brazil. And it is even worse when we know that number of cases increases as elections approach. So that's a real risk in 2022. With the strengthening of the militias and with the elections coming, I think we have this link of this more concrete risk regarding political violence, militias, and elections in this year. So, therefore, it will be very important to observe the profile of candidates in 2022 elections to understand if they have this link with militias or organized crimes. It will be very important to establish mechanisms for regulation and control over elections, and also to press for the authorities, even if they are sometimes involved with the militias themselves, to press the authorities to protect and prevent such crimes. So social control will be fundamental. So it will be important to keep track of what will happen in 2022. And the second aspect of this political violence I would like to focus is political violence against human rights activists and against women candidates. The other face of this political violence, not necessarily against politicians and candidates, is against human rights activists for social causes, and other kinds of activists, and even journalists. This kind of violence is not new in Brazil, and unfortunately is very, very frequently. And what has changed in these recent years is the way in which politicians and decision makers have publicly positioned themselves in relation to these types of violence, often legitimizing them. During this term, President Bolsonaro has repeatedly and openly spoken out against NGOs, activists, and even journalists, tacitly authorizing the practice of violence against these groups. This is a recent important shift in our country, and it is an important field that can intensify this type of violence in an electoral year. A survey by the Igarapé Institute in 2021 showed that 27% of women human rights and environment activists in the Amazon region have suffered moral violence. Almost 20% have suffered physical violence, and 14% have received gun threats. So these numbers, unfortunately, that's a concrete example of how this kind of violence it's happening in Brazil. And specifically regarding violence against women politicians, we have some emblematic cases, I choose two. They are very different, one from each other, but I think it's interesting to explain a little bit about this phenomenon. The first one is the sad and the terrible case of Marielle Franco and her driver. They were brutally murdered in 2017, and honeylash, everything that Bruno explained. And the second one is the case of the federal deputy, Joyce Hasselman. She was elected as a strong supporter of President Jair Bolsonaro. But then she began to oppose it, especially Bolsonaro's sons. Hasselman started being attacked on social media, receiving threats of sexual assault and attacks related to her physical appearance. These attacks had very serious physical and psychological consequences to her. This kind of violence against women has not to be with ideological position. This is specific, the example of Joyce Hasselman, has not to be with ideological position. She's a strong right-wing politician, but has to do with gender, and we have to take a look on that. Electoral Transparency Report on the 2020 elections shows that the political violence against women often takes place through disqualification, mockery, difficulty to run in the elections, and unequal distribution of resources. So it's very important to monitor this kind of violence also in an electoral year. So to finish, if I have to choose 3 points to say that this year will be especially challenging, I would choose increase of civilian gun ownership and the risk of anti-democratic political use of these guns, a government that defends and legitimizes the political use of guns, violence against activists and other groups, and high level of violence, concrete level of violence against candidates, both men and women, and against activists. I don't want to be panicked, but I think it's very important to look to that. So I hope we can discuss a little bit more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carolina. That was absolutely fantastic and really enlightening. Disturbing set of points that you make, but I think absolutely critical, and certainly points that I think anyone who's been, in the United States or following politics in the United States for the last few years, it's something that's not at all foreign to our politics. Quite the contrary. I look forward to discussing some of those themes in the conversation as well. Now I'd like to ask David to stepping in for Renato to tell us a little bit about the police side of things and the increasing politicization of Brazil's police over the last few years.
Thank you.
Go ahead, David.
Hi everyone. I would like to thank you, Professor Benjamin, and his staff for the organization of the event and for the opportunity to share with you these reflections that we made in Brazilian Fórum on Public Safety over the last two and a half years, and also collaborating to build a public debate on police and security in Brazil. I also greet the other panelists and the audience. Well, Jair Bolsonaro can be accused of many absurdities and nonsense. His administration is, by several metrics, one of the most dysfunctional and chaotic that Brazil has ever had. Several spheres of public bureaucracy are under attack and weakened. But at least in one area of government, the president acts in a planned and methodical way in public security. In this case, there is no chaos or bravado. It is though the police forces that Bolsonaro pursues his goal of destroying the foundations of the new republic, created by the redemocratization and the 1988 federal constitution. Bolsonaro also materializes a dispute about the role of the police forces in controlling social order in Brazil. The policies adopted after the new constitution were not capable of carrying out reforms that democratized the police forces and oriented actions considering public security as a fundamental right and not as any activity aimed exclusively at criminal prosecution. There have been several attempts to modernize the institutional architecture of the police over the years, but none of them reached the core of this system, where operational patterns are reproduced that, if not explicitly based on violence, accepted it as common language of our social relations. President Bolsonaro takes advantage of this disjunctive environment in public security to build a symbiosis of narratives between his project of power and the professional identity of Brazilian police officers. A symbiosis that tries to reinforce the political conservatism of police officers and, at the same time, stimulate the radicalized protagonism of these officers in public life. The Federative Pact in Brazil, established by the Constitution, neglected the governance of the police. This ended up producing the picture that we have today, of dissonance among different spheres of public power, which encourages fragmentation and isolation of the troops. On a day-to-day basis, the police do what they think is right, without anyone effectively controlling them. Contributing to this scenario is the fact that, in the last decades, corporative demands and police perceptions have been diluted in a kind of zero-sum game. Police officers started to compete for political positions with the objective of unlocking reforms and influencing the directions of public security. This action, however, is weakened because the interests of representatives of different careers that make up police forces in Brazil are often contradictory. The agendas defended by civil police delegates are opposed to those defended by military police officers, for example. There is a consensus among police agents about the urgency of reforming and valuing the career, but there is also a huge disagreement about how to do it. All former presidents of the Republic since 1989 tried not to get involved directly with public security, leaving the state police isolated and or limited themselves to giving financial support to the states. Most presidents thought that security was an agenda of governors and that it would not be politically convenient to get involved with it. It was Bolsonaro who broke this pattern, taking responsibility for the issue, even if in a purely rhetorical way. While his predecessors kept their distance from the problem, he took on public security as a priority issue, thereby raising the expectations of police officers, which until then have been frustrated by the tortuous governance model that I have described. His authoritarian discourse of eliminating enemies and using violence to perform a kind of moral cleansing of the country had great adherence in police class. This is not a small part of the population. Considering policemen, military personnel in general, and their families, this group is composed of approximately 18.5 million Brazilians. Aided by the drop in lethal violence in Brazil, a phenomenon that has occurred since 2018, before his inauguration, Bolsonaro has built a political narrative in which he places himself and the police, especially the military police, in the role of protagonists in the area, in which all former presidents appeared only as supporting players. In 3 years of government, he did little of substance and not infrequently displeased corporate interests of the non-military police. Still, Bolsonaro came to dominate the framing of the public debate with absurd proposals, such as authorization for the police to kill without being investigated, the creation of an anti-terrorism law that would allow him to repress social movements, among many other examples, as Carolina told about the the access to guns, for example. Bolsonaro has understood that, given the complexity of the Brazilian political system, investing in the conquest of the police base is an electoral calculation that guarantees him a comfortable floor of support for the elections, and that neutralizes the ability that names from the conservative field would have to replace him as an opponent of the Workers' Party, the PT, and the political left. That's not all. He also knows that he will probably be the only candidate race to speak openly about public security and projects for the area. The others are not likely to discuss reform in the sector due to reverential fear that the police impose. This is why Bolsonaro can promise salary increases for the federal police officers, and if this promise is contested by public finance managers, blame it on others and back down without any sweat or tear. The president has created a management model that exempts him ability for the consequences of his actions, a model that forms political radicalization and thrives on mobilizing conflicts and contradictions. Brazil is another example of how police are becoming radicalized and becoming part of the populist calculations of destabilization of democracy and violation of human rights across the world. More than traditional coups perpetrated by the armed forces, the destabilization of many democratic societies is being caused by the low accountability and excessive insulation of the police forces. The radicalization of the police in Brazil can only be faced with substantive reforms in the architecture of public security, a theme that, paradoxically, is very unlikely to be seriously discussed in 2022 elections. One way or another, a question remains that we need to face. What do we want to put in place of Bolsonarism if it is defected in the election? The natural tendency of realpolitik is to leave everything as it is and avoid friction. We need, however, to build an urgent project to be put in place right after the campaign in order to avoid the reproduction of everything we have been denouncing for the last decades. If this does not occur, Bolsonarism will remain as a menacing specter prowling public security in Brazil. So that was the text that I was to read, and I'm available for the discussion.
Great, thank you, Dave. Again, a series of really important and of disturbing but important considerations, and certainly a small slice of a much larger problem, as unfortunately all of you have been forced to do today, is sort of cram into 10 minutes, really long, large historical problems that have only become more acute in recent years. And certainly our last presentation is no exception. So Oliver is going to talk a little bit about armed forces and their relationship to Brazil's democratic institutions. Take it away.
Thank you, Ben. It's a pleasure to join this discussion. And what I'd like to do is, in my 10 minutes, just very briefly talk about the historical context of the armed forces' role in democracy in Brazil, its role in the Bolsonaro government specifically, the specter of a very contentious election during which potentially the incumbent will not accept the result, and then finish with the role of two actors in this context, which I think are quite important. The first is Lula, and the second are the United States. So historical context, very important to keep in mind that contrary to Argentina and other Latin American countries, Brazil's armed forces did have a great say in the transition to democracy. So they were able to negotiate the terms of democratization from a position of strength. In Argentina, the armed forces had not only destroyed the economy, but they just lost a war. So they were pushed into, let's say, back by civilians who were quite empowered, because there was a strong notion that things had to change. Whereas in Brazil, again, the armed forces were able to dictate the terms much better. That has led to a series of severe consequences for Brazil's democracy, and we're seeing that right now. The first is no public reckoning at all. The armed forces have never publicly come to terms with the horrors of the military dictatorship. And throughout the past decades, it has been absolutely normal in meetings with the military, be it over a glass of wine or in a more official setting, that military officers would say that things were much better under the dictatorship. So that was not, non-PC to say. Another consequence is that the armed forces kept a tremendous amount of economic privileges, and that even at the, let's say, the height of democracy, let's say that when democracy in Brazil seemed to be very consolidated, no politician would dare to touch these privileges. And that, I think, shows that the military weren't actively participating in the political process, but you also didn't really want to mess with them. Another consequence of that failure of public reckoning is that the armed forces remained and remain until this day one of the most trusted institutions of Brazil, much more, by the way, along with the church, much more trusted than Congress, the media, the Supreme Court, the president, highly trusted institution. Brazil didn't have a Ministry of Defense until 1999. The generals were sitting in the cabinet. It was a sign that civilians were slowly taking control over military power when Fernando Cardoso created the Ministry of Defense, but his first ministers of defense were so weak that they were just stamping basically stuff that was given to them by the generals. The first Minister of Defense, who was actually politically powerful, was Nelson Jobim, and he created a lot of friction with the armed forces. He was a former Supreme Court justice, so he decided, for example, to wear a military uniform. And several generals said, "How can he do that? He's not above us in the hierarchy." And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided, yes, the Minister of Defense is above, hierarchically speaking, the generals, and he can wear a uniform. And that led to the ouster of several generals at the time who spoke out publicly against Nelson Jobim's decision. So he, I think, was the high point of the assertion of civilian control over the military forces. But again, pension reform under the Temer government didn't include the military. You just don't want to mess with that. Then came the Truth Commission, which peaked under the Dilma Rousseff government. And that, I think, despite the fact that the Workers' Party oversaw the largest military purchases in Brazil's history, that turned the relationship between the Workers' Party and the armed forces to a very difficult one, because that went very much against one of the principles and terms that the armed forces would have liked to keep that way, is to not really talk much about the atrocities committed and the human rights abuses committed during the military dictatorship. Then you did have a growing involvement in the political process, I would say, starting now for the past 8 years, coming more out into the open. But I do also think that the larger role of the armed forces is a symptom of Brazil's weakening democracy, particularly after 2014. The Temer government did have several generals, and this very short tradition of having civilians leading the Ministry of Defense ended with Bolsonaro. And you now have lots of generals back in power again. Something where the armed forces have some agency, but also a vacuum of power with such a profound instability, which has shaped Brazil's democracy basically since 2013, that they've to some extent filled the void, because they still project, and that was one of Bolsonaro's main campaign promises. He said, "I'll bring in the armed forces because they project stability." And that's still, I think, a quite influential argument to make. I think the height of the re-engagement of the armed forces actually took place before Bolsonaro became president. And that was in April 2018, when the Joint Chief of Staff, Vilas Boas, threatened publicly the Supreme Court a day prior to the decision of whether to keep Lula out of jail. And that, I think, was really a sign that the armed forces were back in the game. Now, briefly, during the Bolsonaro government, you now have an unprecedented, since democratization, militarization of politics and politicization of the armed forces, where the barracks have really are now highly politicized, where authoritarian ideas and thinking are really very present. And if you look at WhatsApp groups, websites, discussion rooms, etc., the armed forces, particularly lower level armed forces, were strongly behind Bolsonaro's campaign and continue to be there. The number of armed forces in the government has increased dramatically. You now have over 7,000 armed forces. About half of them are active duty. Among them, for most of the pandemic, the Minister of Health was an active duty general, and which created, of course, a lot of confusion, because people who criticized the Minister of Health were also at the same time criticizing an active duty general. So I think that was another symbol of how closely the armed forces were getting involved in decision-making processes. The armed forces also didn't really offer much pushback when it became increasingly evident that Bolsonaro had not only made authoritarian declarations during the campaign, but he was actively pursuing an erosion of Brazil's democracy. And I think in a way, the military thought that it could enjoy the benefits of being in government without paying the price. And they're now a bit of a bind, because they know that Bolsonaro is not particularly popular. He may question the results. And it's unclear, and I'll come to that now, how the armed forces will react. They don't want to give them the perks, because if you are an active duty general or even a colonel and you join the Ministry of Health, you get 2 salaries, right? That's quite significant. So these 7,000 people in a Lula government will lose that government job. And Lula has already made that very clear, that he will not have all these military people in government. So I think the armed forces were also lulled in a bit. It's not like all the generals wanted to govern. They just, I think, were engaged. It was a bit like the government was clearly, I wouldn't say disintegrating, but was taking a turn to the worse. And some military folks said, we need to get away from Bolsonaro, like Santos Cruz, who left the government. But others said, we need to save this government. We need to go deeper into the Bolsonaro government, a bit like the Vietnam War dynamic, right? So there was a lot of resistance too amongst the generals who said, I don't want to be associated to that government. Now, what would the armed forces do if you have a January 6th scenario? I think that's a very important question. What I do think, my sense is that the most radicalized institution is actually the military police, what we just heard from David. I'm most worried about an insurrection with a lot of people, the military police, rather than the armed forces. What I am worried about is that they may just sit back while the military police is joining an insurrection, a January 6th style insurrection. I think there's no doubt that if Bolsonaro loses to Lula, Bolsonaro will not be there to hand over the presidential sash to Lula. I think it's most likely that he'll question the results. He's doing exactly the same thing that Bolsonaro has been doing, is basically saying there'll be fraud, we must reform the electoral system. And then basically the discussion will, to what extent will armed Bolsonaro followers be there to fulfill that role? I think that a lot will depend on if Bolsonaro loses, he could still very much win the election. But if he does lose, I think it depends how he will lose. If he loses by a couple thousand votes, I think the risk is extremely high for the armed forces engaging in some kind of ambiguous game. If it's a landslide victory by Lula, I think pulling that off is much more difficult. So I think extremely hard to predict the reaction. What is noteworthy is that Bolsonaro sacked his Minister of Defense. quickly last year. And then all the heads of the military resigned in protest. He's now surrounded by loyalists, and I think his vice presidential candidate will be a general who's seen as ultra loyalist as well. So we'll have to sort of see also what opinion polls will say to assess the risk of the armed forces in Brazil acting very differently from the armed forces in the United States, where from the outside, at least, I'm not at all a specialist on US politics or the role of the US military, where it seemed to be a very clear signaling from the armed forces that they would not engage in some kind of anti-democratic experiment. And just to finish, I think there's two things that are worth mentioning sort of more concretely. The first is that Lula is, in a way, embracing like never before. I would say like never before, reaching out to centrists and having a very sophisticated strategy of reaching out to groups that are most afraid or resistant to his re-election, social conservatives. He's picked a social conservative, or he's likely to pick a social conservative as his vice presidential candidate, former governor of São Paulo. The military police through Márcio França, the armed forces through Nelson Jobim. That hasn't worked so far. The markets, financial markets, he's already saying that he won't, change or touch central bank independence, et cetera, et cetera. Agribusiness, he will hand over the Ministry of Agriculture, most likely to his vice president. And basically, the better Lula is able to establish a dialogue with the armed forces, the less likely, I think, a neutral, let's say, a tacit support or an active role in a January 6th style scenario of the armed forces will be. And finally, as a policy recommendation kind of thing, I think that the United States hasn't made sufficiently clear to the government that the approximation that has, the rapprochement that has taken place over the past years between particularly the military, there's now quite sophisticated engagement between the armed forces, would end if there were to be a successful January 6th scenario. I think that hasn't made sufficiently clear. There is still a sense amongst particularly Brazilian armed forces that in the end, the United States focusing particularly on containing the role of China, but also on climate change, would perhaps turn a blind eye if there were to be a rupture of democracy in Brazil. And I think there's ways to make that clear, that the consequence of such a scenario would be diplomatic isolation. So I'll stop here. Back to you, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Wow, there's just so much to process here. And I want to thank all of our panelists for really providing just a incredible summary and pointed commentary about these very varied threats that these different sectors of Brazilian society could pose. I guess so I have some specific questions for our panelists, which maybe I'll mention, but I think on the first go around, I would just like to sort of ask each panelist to just very briefly sort of lay out in your own mind, and having heard each other speak so far, what is your nightmare scenario? What is your scenario, a sequence of events where things could just go drastically wrong? I think at this stage of the game, we can all imagine things working out okay. In particular, I think, as Oliver kind of mentioned, if Lula runs with Alckmin as his running mate, Alckmin's a staunch centrist, was once an opponent of Lula. So, this is kind of reaching across the aisle. If that works, if people are, if a broad swath Brazilian society feels safe, if the financial markets feel safe, and Lula wins in the first round of elections or something like that, you can sort of spell out a scenario where, well, what are you going to say? What are you going to do? What are you going to say? Maybe Bolsonaro is angry and maybe his base is angry, but they're just too, sort of in the minority to do much about it. And all these sectors of society realize they're going to have to just accept this, and it's better to just move on or something like that. I think we can all imagine scenarios where, democratic institutions function the way they're supposed to function. But I'm curious what people's sort of worst nightmare scenarios are. And again, with the caveat that that these don't necessarily need to be likely scenarios, right? But what are the ways in which these threats could combine into sort of a very bad situation? Now, I realize I just said that in English, so I'm going to try to say that in Portuguese and empurrar esse debate para o português. Então, a minha pergunta é: qual é seu cenário, o pesadelo, em que essas ameaças se misturam de uma forma em que realmente ameaça ou a eleição ou a transição pacífica de poder, ou a viabilidade da democracia pós-eleição, nos anos que estão por vir? Vamos fazer uma ronda rápido das panelistas e ver por onde saímos. So, vamos na ordem das apresentações. Bruno, você quer começar?
Sim, posso começar. Bom, como o Oliver fez esse resumo do cenário atual, eu concordo que, caso as coisas permaneçam e a política permaneça sendo feita com essa moderação e da forma como o Lula vem fazendo, eu acho que existe uma grande possibilidade de a gente ter uma sucessão tranquila. Ele fazendo parcerias e alianças com o centro, acalmando o mercado, acalmando as próprias Forças Armadas. Eu acho que existe essa possibilidade e, de uma forma talvez mais fria e talvez mais otimista, eu acredito que vai acontecer assim. Agora, eu acho que existe a possibilidade do inesperado, e isso me atormenta. O fato de haver um atentado, eu acho perfeitamente possível isso acontecer. O próprio presidente sofreu um atentado, o candidato a presidente sofreu um atentado, Lula sofreu um atentado, coisas inesperadas que promovam razões para desordem, para que seja criada no ambiente político uma sensação de desordem e de conflito. Eu acho que o pesadelo ou o risco que a gente corre seria muito mais de algo inesperado ou aleatório acontecer, fora do que caminha, do que a gente tem caminhado na política. Eu acho que, se tudo permanecer como esperado, as coisas caminham em ordem. Só que o problema é que há muitas possibilidades de coisas inesperadas acontecer diante de vários conflitos e potenciais bombas a estourarem nesse percurso de um ano, né? Então, o meu pesadelo são esses eventos inesperados e aleatórios envolvendo violência.
Carolina?
Olha, estava aqui pensando, né, quando a tua pergunta, desde que você fez, ela ficou ecoando na minha cabeça, né? Porque eu acho que tem duas coisas. Por um lado, é meio contraditório, né, o que eu vou dizer, assim, mas eu acho que vai correr tudo bem. Eu tenho um lado meu que acha que assim, tem muito problema acontecendo, mas eu ainda tenho eu acho que a gente ainda tem instituições que têm lampejos, né? Então, quando a gente fala da polícia militar, a gente viveu um 7 de setembro que foi meio assustador, estava todo mundo com medo se as polícias iam para a rua se manifestar em prol do presidente, causar desordem. E aí, né, tudo, enfim, em grande medida correu bem, e ao se aprofundar um pouco nisso, a gente entende que você tem as instituições, as lideranças, e você tem grupos, né, que eventualmente podem sim fazer barulho, um pouco como o Oliver traz, né? O exército também tem as suas discordâncias, você tem uma visão mais institucional, tem os grupos, então eu acho que enfim, existe esse risco dessas pequenas explosões, mas eu acho que, de uma forma geral, a gente sustenta, né? A gente passa por isso, apesar de uns balanços aí ao longo do tempo. Dito isso, apesar de parecer uma leitura, né, que tem um certo otimismo, eu me preocupo muito com Bolsonaro aceitar, de fato, os resultados das eleições, né? E legitimar esse processo, como eu trouxe um pouco na minha fala, né? Assim, conforme se ele vai minando, né, junto com seus apoiadores, vai fortalecendo esses grupos de apoiadores para deslegitimar as eleições, deslegitimar o processo eleitoral, criar esse caos com as polícias, jogar com as polícias, que começam a se contrapor aos seus governadores, né? A gente vai criando focos que podem causar essa desordem e que, num momento que acho que é um pouco que o Bruno traz, se há essa não aceitação por parte do presidente, é muito mais fácil de inflamar esses grupos, né? E aí tudo pode acontecer. Então, eu acho que, assim, embora eu acho que a gente vai passar bem, é esse o meu medo, né? Assim, essa construção gradual, a deslegitimação dos resultados das eleições, colocar combustível nesses grupos ao longo do tempo, sejam alguns grupos de policiais, dos grupos armados, e isso ser a base para um caos que não sustente e não apoie os resultados das eleições. Acho que esse é o meu pesadelo.
Muito bem, muito bem. Eu vou comentar isso, mas vamos ouvir o Davi e Oliver.
Bom, eu acho que concordo bastante com o que Bruno, Carolina e o Oliver falaram. Eu tinha notado aqui dos muitos capítulos desse pesadelo seriam, né? Eu acho que os atentados que o Bruno traz, tanto na campanha quanto num eventual dia de posse, né? Eu acho que esse é um cenário bem concreto, porque, como o Bruno bem disse, pode vir de qualquer lado, né? E a gente já teve esse problema, de certa forma, nas eleições anteriores, né? Sem contar todos os atentados que a Carol citou também nas eleições municipais. Então, esse é um risco grande. Eu acho que é fundamental que as candidaturas estejam pensando nesse aspecto, né? E não sei se estão tanto. Acho que as frições, quando a gente fala dessa eleição, e aí olhando para os aspectos estaduais, acho que as correlações de forças em cada local vão ajudar um pouco a iluminar uma tendência nacional, né, para um processo de transição. Hoje eu não tenho muita clareza de como isso se daria. Hoje a gente tem poucos estados, digamos assim, numa posição de oposição ao governo federal. Como seria esse cenário numa eventual vitória do Lula, por exemplo? Viria com vitórias em mais estados? Haveria uma correlação de forças mais equilibrada no plano estadual? Porque eu acho que isso vai dizer claramente o potencial, né, de risco que existe nas frições principalmente entre as polícias e os governadores, né? E aí o pior cenário, na minha visão, é o que a gente acompanhou no começo de 2020 no Ceará, em que você tem uma greve de policiais militares, inclusive encapuzados, de certa forma apoiada pelo governo federal, que teria a possibilidade de enviar tropas federais para manter a ordem enquanto durasse esse conflito, né? Então, esse ponto especificamente, a relação do governo federal com o Estado e das polícias com os governadores, principalmente por demandas salariais, eu acho que esse é um ponto muito importante que pode persistir, inclusive, ao longo do mandato, né? Como tem ocorrido, né? Por outro lado, acho que um caso como o da invasão do Capitólio, em que reunisse, dependendo do resultado de fato da eleição, se muito apertado e tal, policiais e esses grupos que a Carol enumerou que estão tendo cada vez mais acesso à arma de fogo, esse também é um cenário possível, embora eu ache talvez menos provável, né? E, por fim, acho que a gente, durante o governo Bolsonaro, passou por um processo de afrouxamento de uma série de controles institucionais, seja com relação às armas de fogo, mas também se a gente olha para a política climática, por exemplo, política de preservação ambiental, né, por outro lado, uma série de fragilizações, né, uma institucionalidade que vai se fragilizando. Se uma nova gestão vai tentar reforçar essas legislações ou trazer de volta algumas delas, acho muito provável que haja resistência. E agora uma resistência talvez inclusive mais armada. Então, me preocupa a persistência e o crescimento de conflitos rurais, conflitos florestais, né, com relação a populações tradicionais, indígenas, né, principalmente no Centro-Oeste e na Amazônia. Então, acho que esse conjunto de problemas seria o meu pior pesadelo.
Excelente. Oliver, também queria ver. Eu acho que você já meio que já transmitiu um pouco a ideia do pesadelo, mas eu queria também esclarecer um ponto. Você falou em o papel das policiais militares no eventual 6 de janeiro, evento tipo 6 de janeiro. Eu queria entender melhor se você está pensando vamos dizer, uma insurreição, uma insurgência mesmo de policiais militares, ou mais, por exemplo, uma outra greve, greve geral das polícias militares, que geraria um caos, um pico de crimes e homicídios, como tem visto no Ceará e também no Espírito Santo, onde houve uma greve, uma suposta greve das PMs. Era mais só para entender melhor exatamente
Claro. Olha, eu acho que são dois tipos de risco, né? Claramente existe uma réplica, uma repetição daquilo que a gente viu no Ceará a nível nacional. Eu, acima de tudo, pensei, né? Comentei isso agora, de um cenário de uma participação ativa da PM no contexto de violência pós-eleitoral, se houver um chamado por parte do presidente da República dizendo que é preciso defender a democracia, né? Porque ele não vai dizer vamos desrespeitar o desejo do povo, ele vai dizer que essas eleições foram roubadas, e da mesma forma que as pessoas que participaram da invasão no dia 6 de janeiro em Washington, as pessoas que participariam de um possível confronto em Brasília depois do segundo turno, seriam pessoas que acham que é preciso proteger o presidente legitimamente eleito, né? E aí teria que ter supostamente revelações sobre falsificações e tudo isso, né? E aí eu acho que o meu pesadelo seria que a oposição atualmente fracassa nesse processo de aproximação, porque o Lula também precisa dizer, como ele disse recentemente, que ele vai tirar essas 7 mil pessoas do governo, né? Que não há espaço para os militares no governo. Quando ele disse isso, a gente acompanhou uma comunicação muito forte dos grupos pró-bolsonaristas, dizendo que haverá uma caça às bruxas, haverá perseguição contra todos os militares que se juntaram, que fizeram parte do governo Bolsonaro. Então, como não apenas, vamos dizer, proteger a democracia no dia 6, agora nas eleições em outubro, mas como evitar a criação de um mito, né, de uma história, de uma lenda, de que as eleições foram roubadas, que a gente está vendo nos Estados Unidos agora. A leitura de Bolsonaro do dia 6 de janeiro é que, tudo bem, ela não foi possível para o Trump se manter no poder, mas mesmo assim ele está super bem, né? O Partido Republicano está prestes a ganhar os midterms. O Trump conseguiu, apesar de ter perdido as eleições, ele conseguiu se manter como pessoa que controla a direita nos Estados Unidos, né? Isso eu acho muito, muito preocupante, que além desse pesadelo a curto prazo agora, existe um outro pesadelo da gente ter 20%, 30% da população que não vai reconhecer o próximo governo como legítimo, que pode criar também uma radicalização a longo prazo nas Forças Armadas. Então, isso será um processo muito, muito difícil de desmilitarizar a política sem radicalizar essas pessoas que claramente vão ter que abrir mão de muitos privilégios.
Excelente, excelente. Eu agregaria só 2 observações do mundo dos Estados Unidos, né, que vocês mesmos, né, tocaram. Um é que agora, né, um ano depois de 6 de janeiro, com o trabalho do Congresso, da Câmara em investigar, estamos aprendendo que entre a eleição que Trump perdeu e 6 de janeiro, não é que Trump tinha uma tática ou uma coisa que ele tentou fazer para se manter em poder? Ele tentou qualquer coisa. Ele tentou tudo que cruzava né, os olhos dele. Aí chegava alguém, não, vamos tentar jogar a culpa na China. Vamos. Vamos tentar mandar o exército pegar as urnas. Vamos. Não deu. Ok, vamos lançar ações judiciais. Vamos. Então, acho que esse é um ponto a levar em consideração, que não é que necessariamente num cenário em que Lula ganha, mas a eleição é um pouco apertada, não é necessariamente que Bolsonaro vai tentar uma coisa, você pode tentar um pouco de tudo. E outro ponto é exatamente algo que também foi tocado por vocês, que Trump, ele e os trumpistas se entendem como os verdadeiros democratas, como defendendo a democracia contra o golpismo, contra a fraude, contra tudo. E Bolsonaro se posiciona da mesma forma. Então, é quase garantido que, num contexto em que Bolsonaro perde a eleição, ele não vai dizer que, não, então vamos ter golpe ou vamos ter uma intervenção federal. Não, ele vai dizer, não, somos os ganhadores verdadeiros, a eleição foi fraudada, enfim. Então, e é uma realidade que é um modelo, né, em que você não abre mão da retórica de democracia, ao mesmo tempo que você tenta jogo com tudo para derrubar um resultado eleitoral. Pelo menos é mesmo visto do que está acontecendo, o que aconteceu nos Estados Unidos e o que poderia vir acontecer lá no Brasil. Bom, agora eu quero fazer outra pergunta. Não precisa ser uma rodada necessariamente. Eu vou deixar entre vocês responder de forma na ordem que quiser. Mas o que poderia ser feito agora, entre agora e a eleição, né? Nos próximos meses, durante as campanhas? O que se pode fazer para inocular o sistema político e a sociedade brasileira da maior forma possível para evitar, ou para pelo menos amenizar essas ameaças e esses problemas e essas coisas que estão por vir pós-eleição, qualquer que seja o resultado? Ou existe algumas coisas que já poderíamos começar a fazer, ou começarmos a conversar, começarmos a discutir para já de antemão?
Porque a gente tem, enfim, né, acho que pensado muito nisso, e até, enfim, acho que tem olhar também para os Estados Unidos, né? Eu acho que tem um percurso importante que é fortalecer a qualidade e a legitimidade das eleições, né? Eu acho que isso e para fazer isso, construir o diálogo com diferentes grupos, né? Então, quais são os grupos que eventualmente podem... Então, isso que o Oliver falou é assustador, né? Já está circulando no WhatsApp dos militares o mito de que vão ser perseguidos, como já está circulando que o Lula com os evangélicos, né? Então, eu acho que precisa ter uma estratégia importante de comunicação, né? Então, hoje a gente vê, e é claro que é só um exemplo pequeno, mas o TSE fazendo um esforço, né, de construir pontes, de fazer comunicação, de dizer, olha, né, então a comunicação ela é muito importante, é preciso pensar comunicações específicas para grupos, como é que a gente chega nas polícias, porque a gente fala, né, a polícia bolsonarista, a polícia conservadora, né, lei e ordem, mas a polícia não é um monolito, né? Você ser conservador não significa que você seja antidemocrático, né? Então, é preciso encontrar, eu acho, nas instituições, nos grupos, esses canais de diálogo, porque eles existem, né? Então, eu penso muito do nosso lugar, né, de sociedade civil, sou da Paes, é uma organização, que pontos a gente pode construir, né? Existem grupos de policiais com quem a gente possa trabalhar, construir uma visão de segurança pública para as eleições e para depois, ocupar um espaço que ou é vazio ou que Bolsonaro ocupa, né? Os próprios, acho que essa questão dos próprios, enfim, né, conservadores que não estão embarcados com Bolsonaro, que é um pouco exemplo, né, do Lula e do Alckmin, que diálogo se constrói, né? Porque eu acho que é possível, é preciso que esses grupos, que inclusive em tese apoiam Bolsonaro, sejam capazes de defender os resultados das eleições, que é um pouco nos Estados Unidos, de alguma forma, eu sei com pouca profundidade, mas tem grupos que embarcaram no Trump, mas tem muito muito republicano que, tudo bem, respeitou o resultado das eleições, e é muito importante que os republicanos tenham respeitado, né? Então, acho que é olhar um pouco para isso, ver quem são os grupos, que tipo de comunicação se constrói, que tipo de trabalho conjunto é possível fazer para que, enfim, e aí dei um exemplo desde a sociedade civil, mas é óbvio, isso é um trabalho político, né, das lideranças, dos candidatos. O campo da segurança pública é muito complexo, o David trouxe isso, o campo progressista nunca se ocupou de verdade desse debate, nunca formulou uma proposta de segurança pública progressista, foge disso e fica esse nós e eles, né? Então, se debruçar sobre isso, falar de valorização policial, falar de dialogar com as demandas das polícias de uma forma democrática, né? Então, eu acho que tem desafios para o campo progressista também a dialogarem com essas outras pautas que são normalmente sequestradas por um campo mais conservador ou antidemocrático, acho que segurança pública é o grande exemplo, e construir propostas para isso. Enfim, falei um monte de coisa, não sei se eu fui muito clara, mas acho que tem um conjunto de reflexões. Passa muito por esse diálogo e comunicação com diferentes grupos.
Thank you, Carolina. Anybody else? Mais alguém quer falar?
Eu só queria agregar, acho que uma coisa importante, que realmente a esquerda hoje foge do tema da segurança pública, foge do tema do papel das Forças Armadas, e isso abre um vácuo gigante que a direita consegue preencher e pautar de fato, né? A gente teve durante todos os governos de esquerda um aumento grande também na área, por exemplo, de homicídios, por exemplo, né? Então, isso eu acho que é exatamente o que a Carolina disse. É preciso incorporar isso num discurso também de centristas. E, além disso, eu acho que é preciso, sim, ter um debate sobre o papel das Forças Armadas, sobre, né, que podem se engajar em outras áreas. Isso foi feito pelo governo Bolsonaro de maneira muito mal planejada, enviou as tropas para proteger a floresta, que, enfim, não houve nenhum treinamento, nenhum preparo, mas pode haver, sim, algum engajamento maior para manter esse engajamento, para evitar essa sensação de perseguição, etc. Esse processo de desmilitarização, ele é muito complexo e precisa ser gerenciado sem também demonizar qualquer engajamento militar na política, né?
Bruno, you have any thoughts? Você tem algum pensamento sobre isso? Porque, inclusive, tem uma pergunta aqui no Q&A um pouco sobre esse ponto, a dificuldade ou a ausência mesmo de uma proposta política alternativa de segurança pública, da democratização da polícia, da democratização de segurança pública, é um problema já de muitos anos no Brasil. É o problema com que eu comecei a pesquisar no Brasil já nos inícios dos 2000 e segue sendo um problema até hoje. Nunca teve uma política da esquerda que consegue, e é bem parecido com a situação nos Estados Unidos. Law and order geralmente são temas da direita, e quando a esquerda, se é um presidente democrata ou um político democrata fala qualquer coisa, vai ser para tentar ser linha dura. Então, é um problema endêmico. Uma das perguntas no Q&A fala de quando falamos da expansão dos paramilitares no Brasil, podemos ter insights das correntes de ativismo, correntes no mundo, advogando por defunding the police, abolindo a polícia. É uma instituição que pode se reformar, ou é uma coisa que intrinsecamente paramilitar, intrinsecamente para legalidade paralelo. Eu estou lembrando que sábado passado, aqui no Rio, nos protestos para Moise, muitas pessoas gritando para abolir a polícia militar, para o fim da polícia militar. Então, não sei obviamente, isso não vai acontecer entre agora e a eleição, mas eu queria ver um pouco os pensamentos sobre esse ponto.
Eu acho, bem, que de alguma forma a esquerda e o próprio Lula, na verdade, me parece, ele está conseguindo, de alguma forma, direcionar um discurso que se contrapõe ao Bolsonaro, que eu vejo com um certo otimismo, que é o seguinte: eu acho que nessa batalha de comunicação, o aspecto emocional da verdade é muito importante, mais do que racional e mais do que objetivo. Você tem que engajar pela emoção. E o Bolsonaro e a força do bolsonarismo e da direita vem muito desse apelo emocional da guerra que resolve problemas agora, imediatamente. Eu acho que depois desses 4 anos, a gente conseguiu inverter esse raciocínio e mostrar que tanto a desordem da polícia, como a desordem paramilitar, ou como o descalabro das Forças Armadas, representa um outro tipo de desordem criminal, e que a esquerda, de alguma forma, representa o Estado de Direito. A gente era acusado, os progressistas que defendiam os direitos humanos, de defender bandidos. A gente hoje está conseguindo reverter esse discurso, me parece, de uma forma emocional, falando que a gente defende, na verdade, o Estado de Direito, e que aqueles que eram a favor do discurso da guerra estão ganhando dinheiro com isso e aumentando e espalhando o crime no Brasil. Então, eu acho que, até por isso, eu vejo essa moderação, esse discurso de alianças hoje com um certo otimismo, porque, de alguma forma, hoje o bolsonarismo e a extrema-direita, cada vez mais, me parecem representar a desordem do crime, ou a desordem promovida pela violência, a desordem paramilitar, a desordem da ruptura do Estado de Direito, a desordem da ruptura da institucionalidade. E, pela primeira vez, nesse período, a gente tem a possibilidade de fazer esse discurso emocional, inclusive para as forças militares, para as Forças Armadas, para o mercado financeiro, para as instituições, de que a esquerda representa a ordem, o Estado de Direito e a legalidade. Então, de certa forma, eu acho que existe esse desafio de reverter o discurso emocional e nos associar ao Estado de Direito e à ordem, e à direita com a desordem e com o crime. Eu acho que isso, de alguma maneira, a gente já tem condições de fazer. Existem fatos objetivos, existem ligação do presidente com crime, com quadrilhas de madeireiros, com quadrilhas de garimpeiros, com quadrilhas de milicianos que estão ligados com o traficante. A direita representa o crime e a desordem, ou a ordem do crime. A ordem violenta é a ordem do crime. E a gente, ou uma força comprometida com o Estado de Direito, representa o Estado de Direito. Eu acho que essa inversão, de alguma forma, em decorrência desses 4 anos e de tudo que a gente está vendo, a gente consegue fazer, ou dá para fazer. Eu acho que o caminho é esse.
Bem, posso pegar esse fio da meada do Bruno?
Perfeito.
Eu concordo bastante com o que a Carol e o Bruno colocaram. Eu acho que a necessidade de construção de um projeto de segurança pública alternativo ao que está colocando aí, enfim, isso não é uma novidade, né? Não é de agora, mas ele é talvez mais urgente do que nunca, né? Acho que, olhando retrospectivamente, a gente teve uma oportunidade de fazer uma reforma completa no sistema de segurança pública, poderia ter sido efetivada no início do governo Lula. Houve, né, uma série de problemas e o resultado foi que esse sentido não foi perseguido né, de reforma completa, né, uma reforma abrangente do sistema. E hoje a gente está colhendo esses frutos, né, continuamos colhendo esses frutos. Hoje eu não vejo espaço político, não vejo janela de oportunidade para uma reforma completa no sistema, como a gente teve no início do primeiro mandato do Lula. Mas eu ainda acho que um projeto muito abrangente para a área poderia oferecer essa alternativa. A gente, no Fórum, fizemos trabalhos recentes com um survey com os policiais que mostrou isso, né? O fato de você não ter um projeto alternativo para a segurança, para as polícias, para as carreiras policiais, de certa forma acaba jogando o senso comum nessa classe de volta para a militarização. E para o fortalecimento desse conservadorismo de costumes e também uma certa forma tradicional de lidar com segurança e com violência. Então, a construção desse projeto alternativo, ela teria que ser feita e aí passa novamente por essa por esse complexo arranjo que nós temos no federalismo brasileiro. Então, a gente tem que discutir na esfera federal e esse projeto ele tem que ser muito bem lapidado a nível estadual, com as lideranças políticas estaduais e com as lideranças policiais estaduais também, né? Acho que passa muito por aí. E precisa ser um projeto concreto, ele precisa ter proposições concretas, porque até então, o que se vê, o que se faz em segurança, historicamente, não passa da página 2, não passa da superfície, né? Então, falar de valorização profissional, por exemplo, ela precisa ser uma valorização profissional real e em termos que representem alguma coisa para a segurança, né? E não meramente uma discussão salarial, como geralmente é feita, né? E, além disso, eu acho que esse debate precisa ser feito de uma forma, de novo, que nem a Carol falou, é uma coisa meio contraditória, né? Ele precisa ser um debate sem exclusão, precisa debater sem excluir, mas em algum lugar precisa ser traçada uma linha, né? Até onde se pode ir, né? A gente tem, né, viu recentemente o debate no Brasil a respeito de, né, influenciadores digitais, né, que podem defender o que é a liberdade de expressão. Posso falar qualquer coisa? Posso defender o nazismo, por exemplo? Não. Então, tem uma linha, em algum lugar a gente precisa colocar uma linha sobre com quem se debate, com quem não se debate, mas tentar trazer para o lado de cada linha o máximo possível de pessoas e de segmento, né? E isso, eu acho que é o momento, né, o ano para que a gente consiga fazer isso é agora, e o papel da sociedade civil nesse processo, eu acho que ele é extremamente importante, né? Como a gente vem fazendo ao longo desse mandato do Bolsonaro. Então, tentar construir essas pontes, mais do que nunca, vai ser fundamental para que a gente tenha um desfecho diferente dos nossos piores pesadelos, como a gente falou na rodada anterior.
So we just have a few more minutes left, and só temos alguns minutos sobrando, e essa conversa já foi extremamente iluminadora. Não vai ter tempo para todas as perguntas que foram feitas, porém, se bem que eu acho que muitas deles, de alguma forma, a gente conseguiu tocar. Mas o que eu vou fazer agora é um lightning round. Eu vou ler algumas perguntas aqui e abrir para você, geral, responder de forma que conseguem nos minutos que nos resta. Uma pergunta vem de Lucas Almendra. Vou traduzir para português. Uma semana atrás, Carlos de Almeida Batista Júnior, comandante das Forças Armadas, pensei que era da Força Aérea, mas deve ser as Forças Armadas mesmo, mencionou que as Forças Armadas iam prestar continência a Lula se ele for eleito. Eu mesmo tinha essa pergunta para Oliver também. Se isso mostra um novo cenário, se isso mostra uma ruptura entre as Forças Armadas e o Bolsonaro, uma tentativa de distanciamento, ou se isso era mais particular a esse general em particular, se isso é indicativo de de grupos distintos dentro das Forças Armadas. Isso é uma das perguntas. Deixa eu continuar aqui. Também uma pergunta sobre a estabilidade, a imagem de estabilidade que as Forças Armadas sempre projetam e a confiança que o povo tem. Eu tenho essa pergunta se isso ainda existe depois do governo Bolsonaro, depois do ministro Pazuello e outros exemplos de mal administração e caos com generais no comando de cargos que geralmente eram comandados por civis num contexto de pandemia, né? Outra pergunta que tivemos do Gabriel Leal, simples, né? Se não houvesse a pandemia, o cenário seria o mesmo? Óbvio que não seria o mesmo, mas é interessante pensar. Desculpa, mas vou agregando perguntas aqui, vocês podem responder as perguntas que vocês querem. Duas perguntas mais ou menos direcionadas a Oliver sobre Estados Unidos e o papel do Brasil no mundo. Se os Estados Unidos realmente tomaria ações contra o Brasil para prevenir uma ruptura democrática, não contra o Brasil, mas no caso do Bolsonaro se aliar com as Forças Armadas, ou as Forças Armadas realmente apresentar-se como uma ação antidemocrática, se os Estados Unidos realmente agiria contra isso ou se acabaria deixando acontecer, né? Eu diria interessante pensar como os Estados Unidos reagiu ao impeachment da Dilma e as falas abertas da Dilma, que isso era uma ruptura democrática, que não repercutiu, pelo menos na liderança nos Estados Unidos. E quais seriam as repercussões prováveis para a estabilidade regional da América Latina e para a posição mundial da América Latina em caso de uma crise eleitoral ou uma ruptura democrática. Essa outra pergunta aqui do David Jacobs, que apareceu na lista, aí a pergunta sobre o papel dos Estados Unidos era da Ana Carolina de Souza Gonçalves. Acho que é isso. Vou lançar essas perguntas agora e quem tiver tempo, quem quiser começar, pode começar. Talvez, Oliver, você quer começar com essas perguntas sobre
Claro. Eu acho que há dois grupos que pensam em Washington, que pensam sobre o Brasil de duas formas distintas. Um dizendo que a gente precisa olhar as questões de longo prazo, é preciso conter a influência chinesa e é preciso trabalhar com o Brasil no combate contra a mudança climática. E não adianta isolar o Brasil, vamos dizer, de forma simplista, só que houve um golpe militar, então vamos manter o engajamento em vez de ceder o espaço para a China ocupar estrategicamente a América Latina. Eu tenho muita dúvida se realmente, vamos supor que, de fato, no caso de uma ruptura democrática, se houver um isolamento por parte dos Estados Unidos, porque realmente o Brasil continua sendo um aliado muito importante em vários sentidos. Então, acho que pode ser uma mistura dos dois. Certamente não haveria uma resposta tão dura como alguns aqui no Brasil esperam. Na região, me parece que há um temor, sobretudo com atores que se inspiram no Bolsonaro. A gente já teve algo parecido no Chile, uma pessoa que há 3, 4 anos era completamente, assim, tinha pouquíssimo apoio, chegou quase da presidência, né? Uma pessoa que disse, eu sou o Bolsonaro chileno. Então, se houver uma reeleição, ou inclusive uma ruptura, isso eu acho que é uma gravíssima ameaça para a democracia na região. Eu vou deixar as outras para os outros participantes aqui, sobretudo o comentário do general sobre o Lula, que ele também achei bem interessante.
Mais alguém? Quem quer falar da declaração do general? Carolina?
Eu acho que é difícil também, né? A gente está nesse campo. Acho que a gente já conversou bastante sobre isso, né? Assim, o que é o exército, enfim, né? E o que tem lá dentro. Eu acho que é uma sinalização importante nessa profusão de visões que é o exército brasileiro, né? A gente tenta achar a linha, né? Por mais que seja um exército militarizado. Então, pode ser um sinal, como amanhã pode ter uma declaração de um outro dizendo o contrário, né? Então a gente vai navegando, eu acho que um pouco nesse caminho. E eu queria, já que eu peguei a palavra, talvez só dizer uma coisa. Eu penso muito nessa questão de como o campo progressista pensa e faz segurança pública, né? Eu acho que o Bruno traz uma visão otimista, talvez um pouco mais do que a minha. Eu acho que quando a gente e tem essa discussão de desmilitarizar ou de defund the police, eu acho que a gente precisa fazer propostas, por mais que a gente precise de reformas estruturais, eu acredito que a gente precisa produzir propostas incrementais. A gente não vai conseguir fazer mudanças nas nossas estruturas policiais se a gente... Ninguém reforma a polícia só com pressão externa, né, da sociedade. Você precisa que a polícia se engaje também. Então, é preciso ter uma pauta e um conjunto de propostas mais incrementais, um pouco mais pragmático. Então, não dá para chegar dizendo vamos acabar com a PM, com a polícia militarizada, não vai dar certo. E é um pouco isso que a gente vem fazendo, né? É muito legítimo essa demanda, por parte, sobretudo, de quem sofre violência, mas a gente precisa achar um campo e que, às vezes, é muito difícil para a esquerda e para o campo progressista assumir. Mas é preciso um pouco mais de pragmatismo, porque é isso, dá para fazer polícia eficiente e democrática com mudanças incrementais contínuas, o que não dá para ficar indo para trás. Então, eu acho que há muito debate sobre isso, o campo, muita gente acha que tem que ser reforma e tem que acabar e começar do zero, ou mudar muita coisa. Eu acho que tem que dialogar com mudanças incrementais, até para a gente ganhar força, tração, aí os quick wins, para poder batalhar e construir uma reforma estrutural. E eu acho que é esse o desafio para o nosso campo democrático, progressista, de proposta para a segurança pública. Não dá para vir com coisas muito ousadas, nesse momento, sobretudo com esse cenário das forças de segurança, das forças armadas. Era isso.
Excelente, excelente. Já estamos na hora de terminar. Eu só quero agregar uma coisa, já porque vocês estão aqui, eu concordo plenamente com a Carolina. Eu estou lembrando, na época que eu a conheci, que foi justamente quando, muito antes de eu fazer doutorado nem nada, eu trabalhava no Viva Rio na época da campanha a favor do Estatuto de Desarmamento. Essa campanha foi, por um lado, um êxito, porque o Estatuto foi aprovado, junto com o Sou da Paz, Viva Rio, e todo um movimento social a favor, e conseguimos, afinal de contas, colocar em prática esse Estatuto. Porém, a campanha do referendo da venda das armas foi um fracasso, não só naquele momento, mas porque ele foi, como para mim, o início do protagonismo do Bolsonaro. E que hoje, naquela época, ninguém sabe quem esse cara era, mas foi uma das coisas e o envolvimento do NRA, os aprendimentos e esse fluxo de know-how da direita americana, da extrema-direita americana, para o que era incipiente na época. Então, isso não quer dizer que não deveríamos ter tentado, isso não quer dizer que o trabalho arduoso de construir políticas de segurança pública democráticas não vale a pena. Mas é para dizer que sim, tem esses contrapassos e esses refluxos e que esses refluxos podem ser perigosos e bem complicados. Mas de qualquer forma, eu acho que eu concordo plenamente com vocês, que não tem uma alternativa a não ser que construir essa visão de Estado de Direito sendo explicitamente democrático. Vou agora passar para inglês. I want to just stop now. I'm afraid we have to stop. It's already been 2 hours, but it's been fascinating afternoon. And I want to just thank again our incredible panel of guests, Bruno, Carolina, David. Renato had to leave, but thanks also to Renato and of course Oliver for just, I found a kind of a mind-blowing series of considerations and facts, opinions, analysis, and conversation. I want to thank all our guests for hanging in there, and please stay tuned. We'll be posting soon news of the 4th installment in this series, and please sign up. Visit the class website to learn more about our regularly scheduled events, which include current events talks throughout Latin America, as well as academic presentations of new books, articles, research, and so on across the disciplines. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you all soon.